Thank you for coming along. This is a part of our new series of In Discussion With. If we could switch over to that, please, and we could see the poster, but that's fine. It's not there. So it's a new talk, which is In Discussion With Paul Smith of Elim Housing, and also immediate past housing minister for Bristol City Council. Obviously, you can see it there up on the screen now. The talk is scheduled to be between 1 and 2 o'clock, nicely within the lunch period, and we've just posed a simple question: what is the future of housing in Bristol? And also wider field. Paul's got a lot of experience in regard to social housing, and also in essence just generally housing and also development within Bristol. And as it being such a large city in the UK, it can be very much transferable to any city across the country or around the world. So that's today's talk. Obviously, I've mentioned in the comments and earlier today, we have another event coming up after this, early January, which is by Elim Housing, which is about growth, CV advice, etc. So please do look at that if you're interested. We have posted the link within the comment box, and there it is. Those are our next 2 January events, which is one from Elim Housing, one is from David Chominsky, one is on job advice, and then the other one is on mental well-being. But anyway, I'll stop talking and I'll hand it straight over to Paul. Paul, welcome, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Desmond, and thank you for inviting me here today. What I thought I'd do, just to get the conversation going, was to give you a little bit of my background in housing, and also the history of social housing in Bristol and how it leads us to where we are now, and some of the developments that are going on in terms of taking us into the future. I'm one of these people who's a great believer that, you know, you can't really understand the present or the future without understanding also the past. So I actually grew up in a 1950s built council estate in the south of Bristol called Hartcliffe, where I was also a tenant for some time. But I first got involved in housing sort of more professionally in 1988, when I became a member of the Bristol City Council's Housing Committee, but also got involved at the same time as setting up a youth homelessness organisation for South Bristol, which is now part of a Bristol-wide organisation called 1625. And in my career, I've worked in a number of housing organisations. I've worked for the National Housing Federation, which is the trade association for housing associations. I've worked for 2 housing associations, one in the Midlands, which no longer exists. It's got swallowed up through mergers, but was based in Stratford-upon-Avon, which I must admit was a lovely place to work. And the other one was a large housing association called Astor, which works across the southwest of England. I've also been chief exec of a couple of charities, one housing related, one not housing related. And as been said, from 2016, I was the cabinet member of housing in Bristol until this September. And then in October, I became the chief exec of Elim Housing Association, which is a relatively small association, just over 800 properties, which works across South Wales, the West Midlands, but mainly in the Bristol and Gloucestershire. And we provide what's called general needs housing for the general population, but also supported housing for homeless individuals and families that have experienced homelessness. And we also manage gypsy and traveller sites. So it's quite a diverse organisation despite its size. I've learned something new about what the your chartered institute is about. I'm a member of another chartered institute, the Chartered Institute of Housing, where I became a chartered member last year. So I'm going to talk briefly about the history of social housing in Bristol, but it could be, as Usman said, it could be pretty similar if I was talking about Liverpool or Manchester or Birmingham or some of the other places that I see people have come here today from, although I don't think it will reflect necessarily the history of Shanghai, which I also saw was on the list. So the idea of social housing, housing that's specifically designed to support people who are poor or otherwise in need, really has its roots in Victorian reformers, and Bristol had its own Victorian reformers who started to build housing in the north of the city, just a small amount of housing. That was interrupted by the First World War. Now, after the First World War, there was this idea that we would create a country fit for heroes, and part of that was about providing new housing. And at that point, over 90% of people lived in the private rented sector. And in Bristol, there were huge numbers of, what would be called back-to-back slums, where basically a family lived in a room. And there weren't even, until we went later into the Victorian period, proper sewage facilities. Central Bristol was, renowned for its cholera outbreaks, and the sewage system that was also introduced by the Victorians, one of the greatest impacts on public health that anything has had before or since. And of course, Clifton was built up on the hills away from Bristol so that it couldn't, smell the stench of the city, which everybody's sewage drained into the docks of the centre of Bristol, because so you can imagine it probably didn't smell that great. In the post-war period, the Homes for Heroes, instead of relying on the private sector, the government decided that it would build housing through local councils. And Bristol Council, in that immediate post-war period, built 4 estates, Hillfields, Bedminster Down, Knoll Park, Sea Mills, and then there were a few more estates built in that post-war period. Probably the biggest was Knoll West, but also parts of Southmead. That building was interrupted by the Second World War, and Bristol was incredibly badly damaged in the Second World War. It had some of the worst bombing in the country. Most of the centre of the city was destroyed by incendiary bombs. So you had that post-war period, which they often said what the Luftwaffe didn't get, the planning department did, and large swathes of central Bristol were demolished and cleared, and new housing was built. But the demand for housing was enormous. And you also had estates built on the edge of the city, in fact some of them outside of the city when they were first envisaged. So places like Hartcliffe, where I grew up, Withywood, Lawrence Weston, further developments of Southmead, Lockleys, whole range, a massive council building programme. And in the immediate post-war years, it was the councils mainly that did the building, because they had first dibs on very limited resources, and so the private sector was always playing catch up. But you did also have, in that post-war period, the development of building societies, which were collectively owned organisations by their members, which allowed people, not the poorest, but certainly people on middle incomes, to be able to raise the money to buy a property. So you did start seeing the growth of owner occupation in that post-war period as well. and that sort of growth continued through the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Interestingly, until 1977, there wasn't a requirement on councils to house homeless people, and so that was quite a significant change in the 70s. The 80s probably produced one of the biggest changes, which was the introduction in 1981 of the right to buy, where council tenants could buy their homes with a huge discount, 60% discount if it was a house and 70% discount if it was a flat. The right to buy had already existed in Bristol, but up until that point, tenants wanting to buy the house would have to pay the full market value, and then the council had a commitment that every house that was sold would be replaced by a new one being built. In the 1980s, there was a massive move away from government policy for municipal development, and so councils were effectively stopped from building. And progressively during the 80s, the government looked for a new way of meeting the housing need, and certainly late 80s, early 90s decided that the mechanism for that would be housing associations. Now, housing associations on the whole predated local authorities in the provision of social housing, but tended to be quite small. In 1979, nationally, councils owned and managed 5 million homes, whereas housing associations owned and managed 250,000. I mean, that's changed dramatically. Now, housing associations manage more homes than councils, typically, although that isn't the case in Bristol. We'll come on to that later. In terms of the right to buy in Bristol, Bristol's housing stock peaked at 48, council housing stock peaked at 48,000 homes. The council now owns 27,000 homes. Over 20,000 were sold through the right to buy. So, but coming back to the 90s, housing associations, a lot of funding was targeted housing associations. Also, local authorities were encouraged for their housing departments to become housing associations, and in the 90s, every local authority in the country had to go through a process with its tenants to decide whether or not they wanted their housing department to become a housing association. And the benefits of that, many saw, was that a housing association firstly could access more money than a council, both to repair its housing and also to build new housing. And so you have seen across the country quite a lot of council housing transfer over to housing associations. And that's certainly, whilst that's not the case in Bristol, in all of the surrounding authorities, there is no council housing. So South Gloucestershire transferred their housing to a housing association which became called Merlin, which then merged with an organisation in the Midlands called Bromford. Bath transferred its housing to an organisation that was called Summer, which is now called Curo. And North Somerset transferred its housing, and the housing association there is called Alliance Homes. So all of those surrounding authorities are dominated by housing associations. In Bristol, the council owns about 27,000 homes and the housing associations about 12,000. So the council's still the predominant landlord. In terms of what's happening now, is that there's starting to be some significant change. So coming into the sort of 2010s, local authorities had new freedoms to set up companies. And so a number of over half of local authorities in England have set up local housing companies, which would allow these companies would be able to access council land, but also to borrow money against their council tax income to build new housing. Now, in some respects, Bristol was quite late to that, but did set up. In fact, I set it up. Gorham Homes, which is a housing company in Bristol, which is about to start. In fact, I think it started on site in Lochleys in the north of the city of building 268 homes, and has another site on the docks to build about 140 homes, and is currently looking at other pieces of land that the council's got that it can borrow to build on. In 2 years ago, Theresa May did something quite extraordinary as Prime Minister. She removed the borrowing cap on council housing departments, which suddenly meant that they could actually build at a much greater scale as well. So Bristol set up a housing company, but also its existing housing department is also able to build. And between the two, I think over the next 5 years or so, between them, they have ambitions to build about 5,000 homes, which will obviously make quite a significant impact on the housing problems within the city. The other thing that is a huge driver now, of course, is climate change, which has been a bit forgotten during COVID, but is very much coming to the fore again. And one of the things that Bristol looked at very early on, both to accelerate development, also to get more surety about the quality of homes, and also to deal with issues around climate change and zero carbon housing, was to set up something called the Bristol Housing Festival. And the Bristol Housing Festival is very much focused around off-site manufacture of homes, and is promoting a number of projects within the city, many of them linked actually back to the council housing department or to Gorham Homes. So that includes a development by Bochloch, the Swedish developer, a partnership between Skanska and IKEA to build homes in the south of the city, and Legal in General, the pension company, to build homes in the north of the city, some of which will be council housing and some of which will be private housing for sale, but all of which will be zero carbon in terms of their construction, as they're built from in factories from timber. Also, in terms of the council's own housing development, it stopped using gas in new developments over a year ago, ahead of the sort of 2025 deadline. And so most of the housing at the moment in Bristol that the council's building is using ground source heat pumps as its main source of heating. But also in the centre of the city, the council is developing a heat network, an underground network, which will allow housing and offices to be heated using mainly water source heat pumps, extracting heat from the water in the docks of Bristol, and allowing that then to be used to heat buildings that can link to that network. And every time a road's dug up in Bristol, the infrastructure is put in to expand those networks to ensure that we can move to a much more carbon efficient form of living within the city. I guess the other area of controversy, if you like, around the city is, where do we build the homes? There's one argument that says, we need to review the green belt, which is land around the city. It's not necessarily green land, despite its title, which was designated in the 50s as areas where very restricted development rights to stop urban sprawl. But but now there are questions raised about, is it better to expand the cities rather than to build lots of housing in the countryside? The flip of that, in terms of not expanding the cities, is then to look at increasing the density within the city, which in city centre areas leads to a discussion about height and building tall buildings, which, as I say, is building into the air is almost as controversial as building into the green belt. But I think the sort of growth in population and the demand for housing, and even the change announced this morning by the government that it was going to focus new housing development on cities, means that probably both the green belt and the blue belt above the city will be encroached by future housing development. So I hope that's given you a sort of feel for how the way that certainly social housing is developed and changed within the city. Social housing within Bristol now is about 20% of the housing stock. At its peak in the sort of late 70s, it was 33% of the housing in the city. And so that structural change in the housing market has had an impact on the way in which housing needs are capable of being met by the local authority and by housing associations. But I'm now happy to pass back to Usman and open it up for people to make comments of their own or to ask me questions, and I'll do my best to answer any points that are raised.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I've actually shared some of the links. So Goran Holmes, Elim Housing, to the comment section. So if anyone wants to have a look there. We have a couple of questions. So I'll kick off with those. So let me just quickly read it. So okay, so it might be a bit, obviously, please feel free to respond as you see fit. So what controls are in place to stop housing associations exploiting service charges, as there seems to be no control, accountability or scrutiny on these increases? Then another is there an increased focus upon passive house design to reduce the running cost for those in social housing? It's quite interesting because I do know in Exeter they've been pushing passive house for quite some time. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this region. And then, okay, this must come up quite often. So, for example, I'll paraphrase what's been written rather than sort of repeat it. But in essence, what's your views on, in essence, larger developers approaching the local authority and submitting applications? And it seems to be, or for example, within the local authority, submitting an application, it seems to go on the face of it to others. I presume this is what this person's meaning, quite swimmingly, whereas when private sector apply for the similar applications, it seems to go not so swimmingly. I'll leave you with those three for the moment, but please do, if anyone has questions, please do feed them in and we can get them to Paul to have a chat.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks. Those are three, I think, really useful questions to kick off the debate. So, in terms of service charges by housing associations, the rules is that the service charge cannot be used to make a profit. Same actually for councils charging service charges. They have to meet the actual cost of the service. Now, there are two, I guess, places you can go. One is obviously if you're unhappy with the housing association and its services or service charges, you can, in the first instance, complain directly to that housing association. If you're not happy with that complaint, you can then go to the independent housing ombudsman, who can then adjudicate about whether or not people are being treated properly. There is also a regulator of social housing called ROSH, the Regulator of Social Housing, which looks at housing associations' policies and procedures. And in doing that, if they feel that the housing association is not actually applying the law properly, can downgrade the organisation, which basically puts it under immense scrutiny in terms of what it can and can't do. So there are courses to and of course, you know, ultimately you can also take an organisation to court. You can use a legal process if you're unhappy. In terms of passive house, I think firstly there is an agreement, I think universally, that any issues around heating and energy have to start with the fabric, and that buildings have to be much better insulated than they are now, and insulation standards are improving generally. I mean, it does leave us with a problem. I mean, there's a lot of focus on new build, but you know, 90% of the houses that are going to be here in 2050 have already been built. And so there's actually a huge issue around the retrofit of existing homes, particularly solid wall housing. You know, in Bristol, we've got lots of Georgian, Victorian houses with solid walls, where it's not quite so easy, or certainly not cheap to insulate to a higher standard. And I think nationally it's said that to retrofit the whole of the housing stock would cost about £20,000 per property, which, given that there are 20 million, I think that comes out about £400 billion. Oh, sorry, no, it's about £4 billion. It's some huge amount of money that would be. I haven't got my numbers in front of me, but it would be enormous. Bristol, which has got 200,000 homes at 20,000 a home, would also be, you know, a large amount of money just for the city to deal with. So passive house is, you know, often seen as the top in terms of the standard for insulation of homes, and as Usman has said, in Exeter, they, you know, it is their policy that any new buildings built by or commissioned by the authorities should be passive house, not just housing. I mean, I think they're trying to build a passive house leisure centre. The issue that's sometimes raised with passive house is that it's only really passive if the people who live in it can use it in a passive house way. So it ceases to be a passive house if the windows are all open, or if you leave the door open a lot, or if you start drilling lots of holes in your walls because you want to hang things up or put up new shelves or whatever. And so I think there are real issues about how user-friendly passive house is. Environmentally friendly, absolutely, but there are issues about, you know, how they're used. On the issue about larger developers getting a harder ride than the public sector, I actually, you know, I took a development to the planning committee, a development for Hengrove Park, 1,400 homes in South Bristol, and it got turned down. And, you know, I had to go back, you know, with the team, go through the issues that have been raised at the planning committee, go back into public consultation, redesign elements of the scheme, actually reduce the number of housing by about 50, I think, to meet some of the requirements, and resubmit and apply again. So I don't actually think it's the case. I think that certainly in Bristol, the planning committee provides as much scrutiny on the council's developments as it does on private sector developments, and quite rightly too. I mean, my view is that the public sector should take the lead in terms of quality, and so, you know, our development should meet all of the planning standards. I guess the difference is between public bodies applying for planning and private companies is that we don't game the planning system in the same way. So we're not, for example, you know, the most obvious thing is in the provision of affordable housing. is in that we are trying to deliver the affordable housing, where unfortunately some developers, not all, but some developers are actively trying not to deliver the affordable housing. And so they're immediately in a conflict with the planning policies of the local authority. I don't think this is just a Bristol issue. I think it's everywhere. We've also had issues that some private developers have not wanted to meet the environmental standards. Whereas, again, if you're a public body, the environmental standards are sort of built into what you're trying to achieve. So it might seem sometimes that the public sector developments go through more easily, although, as I say, my experience is that, you know, I've had a really tough time at planning committees, but it's because we're trying to meet the planning policies, not trying to dodge them. We're a bit controversy there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I'll try and do it one at a time rather than sort of such a mouthful of questions. I know obviously Bristol, probably among other local authorities, are looking at building higher, and obviously we've got the SPD which came out in regard to that for the city in particular, which I presume many other local authorities and cities around the world are looking at. Is that seen as a method in regard to actually in essence meeting the need for housing within Bristol?
I think the thing about building more densely, firstly, does not always mean higher. And in fact, some of our high buildings are not actually that high density. If you look at some of the estates built in the 60s, you could actually probably get as many houses in a terrace street as you could in a high-rise block. So there shouldn't be an assumption that building higher automatically gives you more people per floor area. Although in some places, and particularly infill sites in the centre of the city, I mean, that absolutely is the case. And so I think there are a number of reasons for building at higher densities in cities. One is that it makes the transport infrastructure more viable. It means that if you can have more people living in the centre, more people can walk and cycle to work and to facilities. So it supports those local facilities much more effectively. And also it means you can have more properties linked into the heat network. So I think there's a whole range of reasons why on some sites within central Bristol, height is almost inevitable. And is probably the right thing to do. I think in other locations, we've got tall buildings that aren't functioning, and you could actually remodel parts of high-rise estates to be a higher density, but only a medium height. So I think in Bristol, you will see some areas where there are buildings that are higher than we've got now. And in some areas, you might actually see high-rise buildings coming down and being replaced by medium rise, high density buildings. What I'm not in favour of is compromising on space standards within the buildings. I mean, I think what we've seen through COVID is, you know, your house becomes your school, becomes your health centre, it becomes your place of work, it becomes your gym. It has to form lots of functions, and trying to cram people into really tiny flats, which I know some build to rent organisations sort of argue for sometimes, I don't think is the right thing. I think we have to make sure that the housing is of good quality, that people have at least the minimum space standards and easy access to good quality public open spaces, so that they can get out, they can exercise, they can experience green space around their flats, because they, obviously as flats they won't have gardens, and so you have to think about the whole context of the area around the building and not just the building itself.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. I know the RIBA have done some work on that, where Case for Space, and they've analysed space standards within Europe to understand how different sizes of units are within different jurisdictions. And they've got some information on that. And obviously, I know within many local authorities, they have their own stipulation in regard to, in essence, the adaptability of units and what would be acceptable. So it's a really interesting point you make. I've got another question, which is quite an interesting one, actually. You did lightly touch on it as you just spoke about the larger buildings, but in essence, it's a slight tangent of that. Is basically, do you see opportunity in retrofitting existing redundant inner city commercial premises for social housing? I know that Sovereign have purchased a relatively large site in Brislington, which I presume that they're looking to do something with, but I presume there's definitely opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably, I think, I mean, we're all aware of the huge pressure that retail is under and the huge restructuring of the retail market. And I don't think, we will want to go back to shops. I quite like walking around shops myself, and much more fun than surfing the net. But the need for retail premises is going to diminish. I expect that we will see some city centre shopping areas becoming a mixture of residential and leisure, and so that will definitely be the case. In terms of turning them into social housing, it obviously depends on the finances of doing it, whether the money's, and it also depends on who owns it, because people will need to do that. I think there's because I'm looking at the questions as well. There was a question about permitted development too, which sort of plays into this question as well. Is that permitted development negates the need for social housing, and in that instance, I think that's wrong, and that we should be looking at mixed communities. I don't. I grew up on an estate which was, 3,000 council properties and hardly anything else. I don't think that's right, and I wouldn't want to see that replicated. I think what we want is mixed communities, where in fact you don't even know, ideally, which is the social housing and which is the private housing. And so I would like to see the developments in the centre of the city being tenure blind. As we look to the future of some of these previously commercial sites, and we're already seeing, organisations like Cubics doing some really, I think, generally good work around converting commercial land into a mixture of residential and commercial land. I mean, I know there's a lot of people saying that the office is dead. I personally don't think the office is dead. I think the office might have to change, and the number of days a week we go into it might be fewer than it was before, but we still need actually to meet together in human form rather than just, on Teams or whatever else. We are a social animal, and we need the office space for better quality collaboration. So I think the offices will continue, but I think they'll have, I think, less desk space and more collaboration space into the future.
Definitely, I completely agree with that. Another interesting one, which is definitely going to put you in a bit of a sticky situation, having your previous job and your current job in play, is what's your thoughts and feelings on how housing associations have had to develop manage the requirement for the local authority to allow housing association properties to be purchased under a similar right to buy mechanism, and also how have housing associations adapted to that as a very new model?
Well, firstly, cards on the table. I'm completely opposed to the right to buy with a discount. I think it's it's caused a huge number of problems in terms of the current housing crisis. I think it's one of the causes of the current housing crisis. And, you know, although its objective, certainly in the Thatcher period, was to increase home ownership, what it's actually done is led to the increase in private renting. And on a lot of the estates, you'll see that the properties were bought by a sitting family member, and they maybe had 3 kids. You know, when the kids had all moved out and the elderly relative had died, to get their money back, they then sell the property, which the proceeds of which are split 3 ways, and buy-to-let landlords have then bought up a lot of those properties, so they move into renting, but at 2 or 3 times the rent that the local authority provided, without any of those services that you would get from a local authority. So I think it's been incredibly destructive as a policy. But obviously that's my personal view. In terms of housing associations and the voluntary right to buy, it was piloted in the West Midlands, but at the moment it seems to have died a bit of a death. I don't think it was as popular as the government thought it would be, and it doesn't, for instance, apply to my organisation, and it hasn't been applied generally to associations, and I hope it isn't. And so it hasn't been an issue in Bristol about the housing association right to buy. The climate change, though, is driving something where some housing associations have started selling their older properties in city centres, the Victorian and Georgian properties, because the cost to insulate them would be so great that associations would rather sell them because of that inherent cost that will come at some point, and then use the proceeds to build housing elsewhere. Whilst I can understand why organisations have done that, of course, what that does is in the city areas is it accelerates gentrification and makes those areas much less mixed than they were before. So that has another impact elsewhere.
So as a follow-on to that, obviously the government on an annual basis announces the amount of housing that's required to meet demand, etc. So on, and on every year for as long as anyone ever has known, we fall far short of that. How does a local authority as well as a housing association help inform as part of that, and how can you in essence bring forward the knowledge that you have in regard to managing, because it's not simply actually just building a house, it becomes a much larger thing. So like you've indicated as well, it's not just building houses alone, it's actually building community, which might include facilities and etc. so on. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah,
it's really, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think you're right. It has to be about placemaking rather than house building, and that means you have to think about, are the health services there to deal with the growth in population? Are there enough schools in an area? Will the transport system be able to cope with the additional people coming in? Is there enough green and open space for people to go out and enjoy themselves? What's the quality of the spaces between the homes? There's a whole range of issues that a local authority needs to look at. But of course, there still is a huge demand for housing. The accepted figure by the government is now 300,000 homes a year need to be built. I don't think we've built that many since the 1960s as a country. And to my mind, and again, I'm giving you my sort of very biased personal opinion, the government has tended to put subsidy into the demand side of the housing market. So things like Help to Buy, which has cost billions, and also the recent relaxation in stamp duty, which effectively make it easier for people to buy but the impact of that is just to push prices up further, rather than putting that subsidy into new provision, into the supply side of the housing market, which, you know, grant funding or loans towards the building of more, particularly social housing, where there's a huge shortage in the country, to allow us to meet the housing needs. And I think, you know, our housing problem is you can't solve it by pumping up demand and by pumping up house prices with subsidy. You have to deal with the supply issues, and that's where I think, you know, over the last 10 years, at least, the government's gone wrong. Although I don't think we've really got to grips with housing for at least 30 years. So that's, you know, governments of all colours have really failed to grasp this issue.
Okay, I think we've got time for probably a couple more questions. This is quite an interesting one. Where else in the world would you look to as a model example for of an approach to take on housing? And I guess I'll just add to that. What other initiatives do you see? For example, one measure I typically highlight is the sustainability credentials that they have in the UAE, where they've actually included social aspect into the mix, which I find quite interesting. Not only looking at the measure of environmental, but also the social aspect, which you've obviously touched on in regard to the sort of COVID situation when people are locked into their own homes. Yeah,
well, I mean, one model I think we should look at much more is community-led housing and communities taking control of housing. And you find that they're not necessarily countries that have done really well on that, but particularly cities. So there's been some really good stuff done in Paris and Berlin, particularly around community-led design and making land available for community initiatives. I think we've done a great, I would though think we've done a great job on that in Bristol too. So I think, you know, that, you know, Bristol's actually seen as the leader in the country in terms of community-led housing at the moment, and I think it's one of the ways of helping to deal with people's sort of resistance to housing. I think, you know, some of the European countries like Austria, I think, are doing really well on their housing development. To a certain extent, we've been looking at in terms of the environmental friendliness of housing. We've been looking at Scandinavia, although in their cities their housing's pretty small. But if we look at, you know, that's why we teamed up with Bocklock from Sweden, because, you know, they've got experience of building zero carbon. They've built over 10,000 zero carbon homes in Scandinavia. So they've built factory built housing at scale, and I'm sure there's good examples in most cities in Europe and across the world that we can draw on. And I just think it's useful to be open to new and different ideas. And again, that's why, you know, in Bristol we promoted the Bristol Housing Festival to be a focal point for innovation. Because no one person, certainly no one city or no one country has all the right ideas, and we need to continually be learning.
I think I've got one more question, but also you touched on the point. If you could follow it by telling us more about the Bristol Housing Festival as well, that'd be great. This is. Okay, so I'll do two. So one is, you made a point earlier on tenure blind developments, meaning that basically you would hope that they don't, in essence, prejudice a certain type of tenure against another type of sale, for example. How do you think that could be, the value of that could be translated to, in essence, the developers? as it would directly impact their profit margin, in essence, as in essence they would be making less on a certain type over another's. And then another one, which is, I think, is a cheeky plug, but let's just see. Why have you chosen to team up with European companies for modern methods and constructions when there's a wealth of UK skills and companies that you can use?
Okay, so I'll take the second one first, just to say we are teaming up with UK companies as well. And if you look at the housing festival, we're even teaming up with organisations and companies based in Bristol, and trying to encourage local factories to be built, local jobs to be created, and also in that working with some of the local architecture practices. White Design have been, as a Bristol architects practice, have been very engaged in actually developing community-led housing within the city, and models of construction for that. So what I'm saying is, let's look everywhere, and also, I think bringing some of those skills in from outside the UK, but then using those to help skill up and spread their expertise in the UK is the way to go, rather than just outsourcing all of that outside. In terms of the issue around that was raised about tenure blind and developer profit, for me the issue there is there has to be a recognition that to provide social housing does require public subsidy. It can't all be funded by the developer. It does need government money to make it work. And we've seen that we've most been able to deliver social housing, whether through councils or housing associations, when there is sufficient government resource to actually support that. So I don't shy away from that. It needs government investment, but I think the return on investment to government is really strong. There's much more. There's a much better return to government of building housing than building roads, because irrespective of whether it's a social house or whether it's a private house, somebody moves in, they want to buy furniture, they want to buy curtains, they want to buy carpets, they want to buy other things that you have in houses, bedding and everything else, that actually housing stimulates the economy more than anything else. Also, a house is a tax base, so as soon as you've got a house, somebody's paying council tax from it. So it brings money back into the public sector, not just into the private sector. So housing for government, even subsidised social housing, is a really good investment, as well as obviously meeting a really, really essential need of the country.
Okay, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Bristol Housing Festival as well.
Sorry.
Get to a close.
So just to give a plug, there is United Communities Housing Association, supported by the council, are close to, I think, starting to complete parts of a tenure blind development in Southmead called Elderberry Walk, which is worth having a look at. So the Bristol Housing Festival is a 5-year project aimed at encouraging innovation in housing within the city. The first scheme that was finished under their under their umbrella, if you like, was called Launchpad, is a scheme in East Central Bristol for a mixture of young homeless and students. The idea of trying them to mentor each other and bring them together, and that was built in Hull, in a factory in Hull, and is sort of steel frame building. The second one is a timber frame building by a company called Zed Pods, which has built 11 homes over the top of a car park, also in East Central Bristol, and is now occupied. So very, very different schemes in their form of construction. And as I mentioned, there's the Legal and General and the Bocklock schemes, which have both now got planning permission, which are just both shy of 200 homes each. And then there are some community-based homes like the We Can Make project in South Bristol, which is going to build itself compressed straw bale housing. So the idea of the festival is to encourage innovation, but also to learn from all of the projects. So to publish reports on what people would have done differently, what they've learned, and make that publicly available. So if you Google Bristol Housing Festival, you can come to their website and find more information about them. I think they've done just over 2 years now, so they're almost halfway through their 5-year tenure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Honestly, it's been such an informative and useful talk, and I feel like everyone must have learned quite a few different things from various areas. We've got we'll just quickly plug our next 2 events. So we've got in discussion with our January events are sort of about growth in essence. So we've got Kaylee Fazan, who's an international speaker in regard to personal growth, CV and job advice. So that would be really interesting. So please do come along. And then our next event, which will be again in discussion with, which will be on the 20th of January, is by David Chomsky of Ulster University, and he'll be talking about mental well-being, which is also very important, especially at this time where a lot of people are basically stuck at home. So 2 really good, interesting talks to start off the year. One which is potentially looking at growth, and the other one is looking at your own personal position. Thank you very much, Paul. Once again, and thank you everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all soon, and we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Osman, for inviting me.
No problem.